Behind Nashville's glittering lights lies a darker melody, a song of addiction, pain, and lost souls. These 12 country legends once ruled the stage, their voices shaping the heart of America. But fame came with a deadly companion: pills, whiskey, and powder that stole their genius and peace. From Hank Williams to Johnny Cash, each story reminds us that even icons can fall. This is 12 Worst Junkies in Country History. Mud. Hank Williams Sr., the lonely king of country's darkest road. Before the rhinestones and stadium lights, country music was a raw cry from the heart. And no one embodied that cry more than Hank Williams Sr. Born into poverty in Alabama in 1923, Hank grew up with music as both his salvation and his curse. From the moment he picked up a guitar, his voice carried something different, a blend of gospel sorrow and honky-tonk pain. By the late 1940s, he was Nashville's golden boy, writing classics like "I'm So Lonesome I Could Cry," "Your Cheatin' Heart," and "Cold, Cold Heart." But fame, for Hank, came at an unbearable cost. Behind the perfect phrasing and lyrical brilliance was a man plagued by spina bifida occulta, a spinal defect that left him in chronic, grinding pain. Doctors prescribed morphine and alcohol to dull the agony, and soon Hank became trapped in a spiral that blurred art, addiction, and desperation. His drinking grew legendary and destructive. He'd show up drunk to shows, collapse backstage, or vanish on long benders that left promoters furious and fans heartbroken. Nashville's elite began to whisper that Hank Williams was too wild to save. By 1952, the legend was unraveling. His marriage to Audrey Shepard, once the power couple of country, crumbled under the weight of jealousy, infidelity, and booze. His label, MGM Records, threatened to drop him, and the Grand Ole Opry, once his temple, banned him for being unreliable. Alone, aching, and high, Hank drifted from one motel to another, performing in tiny southern towns for cash, sleeping in cars, and injecting morphine to keep going. The boy who once made America weep now lived like a ghost among his own songs. On the night of December 31st, 1952, Hank was driven through a cold West Virginia night toward another concert he'd never play. In the back seat of his powder blue Cadillac, slumped in a white cowboy suit, he took one last dose of morphine and never woke up. The next morning, they found him lifeless, a syringe and painkillers beside him. He was only 29 years old. Hank Williams Sr. didn't just die of drugs and alcohol. He died of loneliness, pressure, and the unbearable burden of being country's first tragic icon. His voice, soaked in sorrow, still echoes through every generation of artists who dare to sing about heartbreak. In a cruel twist of fate, his addiction gave the world timeless music and took away the man who wrote it. Hushar, 2. Johnny Cash, the Man in Black and the Battle Within. Before he became an icon of redemption, Johnny Cash was a man teetering on the edge of destruction. The deep voice, the black suit, and the rebellious spirit made him one of country's greatest legends. But beneath that image was a long, painful dance with addiction. Cash's story is not just one of fame and fall. It's a testimony to how even the strongest souls can break under the weight of their demons. In the 1950s, as his fame skyrocketed with hits like I Walk the Line and Ring of Fire, Cash's schedule became brutal. Constant touring, sleepless nights, and pressure from the record label left him restless and hollow. To stay awake and keep performing, he turned to amphetamines and barbiturates, the pep pills that ran rampant through the music scene at the time. At first, they made him feel unstoppable. Soon, they controlled him entirely. His friends recalled nights when Cash would stay awake for days, mumbling lyrics to no one, hallucinating that he was being chased by demons in the desert. The addiction began to devour everything. His marriage to Vivian Liberto collapsed under the strain of lies and erratic behavior. He crashed cars, destroyed hotel rooms, and got arrested multiple times for possession. The once golden boy of American music became a walking cautionary tale. On one occasion, he nearly burned down a forest in California after falling asleep high, killing hundreds of condors and earning himself a hefty fine. Cash later admitted that he was so lost, he didn't even care if he lived or died. By the early 1960s, he was near death, gaunt, trembling, and spiritually bankrupt. Then came June Carter, the woman who would become both his partner and his salvation. June saw something in him worth saving, even when he didn't. She stood by him through withdrawals, interventions, and relapses, refusing to give up on the man behind the legend. In 1967, after a near-fatal overdose in a cave near Chattanooga, Cash claimed he heard God's voice telling him it wasn't his time yet. That moment sparked the slow road to recovery, one paved with faith, music, and love. The transformation wasn't instant. Cash would battle addiction for decades, relapsing multiple times. But out of that pain came his greatest work, Folsom Prison Blues, Live, Hurt, and The Man Comes Around, songs that carried the raw weight of redemption and regret. He reinvented himself not as a saint, but as a sinner who kept fighting. His black suit became a symbol of mourning, not just for the poor and broken, but for the parts of himself he could never fully heal. When Johnny Cash died in 2003, he left behind more than music. He left a legacy that proved recovery is possible, even for the most tortured souls. His story remains one of country's most powerful tales, not of perfection. Knockschnarp 3. George Jones, No Show Jones and the Devil's Bottle. Few artists in country music ever sang heartbreak like George Jones because few lived it as deeply as he did. His voice, trembling, raw, and soaked in emotion, became the gold standard for every country singer who followed. But behind that voice was a man locked in a losing war with alcohol and cocaine, a battle that nearly destroyed his life, his career, and his mind. Born in Saratoga, Texas in 1931, Jones grew up poor, with music as his escape from a violent father and an unstable home. When his father was drunk, he'd wake George in the middle of the night and force him to sing. Those nights planted two seeds that would define his life: a God-given voice and a haunting relationship with the bottle. By the 1950s, when he started recording hits like White Lightning and She Thinks I Still Care, Jones was already known for his drinking. But as the fame grew, so did the addiction. Alcohol soon became his only companion. He would go on week-long binges, vanishing before concerts, missing studio sessions, and racking up debts. Promoters and fans gave him the nickname No Show Jones, a cruel but honest reflection of how far he had fallen. His ex-wife, Tammy Wynette, once found him trying to drive to the liquor store on a riding lawnmower because she had taken away his car keys. That story became legend, both tragic and absurd, a symbol of a man who could not escape his demons, no matter how ridiculous the fight became. By the 1970s, cocaine entered the picture, and Jones's life spiraled out of control. He became paranoid, broke, and emaciated, often hallucinating that his enemies were coming to kill him. His concerts turned chaotic, sometimes brilliant, sometimes disastrous. The man who could melt hearts with a single lyric was now melting under the weight of his own addiction. Nashville had written him off as a lost cause, another fallen star who'd never rise again. And yet, in one of country music's most miraculous turnarounds, George Jones survived. After a near-death experience and an emotional reunion with God, he slowly began rebuilding his life in the 1980s. With the help of his fourth wife, Nancy Sepulvado, he sobered up and returned to the stage. Older, slower, but still with that voice that could stop time. His 1980 hit, He Stopped Loving Her Today, wasn't just a song. It was his confession, his funeral, and his resurrection all in one. Jones died in 2013 at the age of 81, having somehow lived long enough to see his own redemption. But he never forgot the darkness he came from. In his memoir, he wrote, "I made a lot of bad choices, but the bottle made more of them for me." George Jones remains proof that even the greatest voice in country music can tremble under the sound of its own pain. How for? Waylon Jennings, the outlaw who snorted away his kingdom. If country music had a rebel king, it was Waylon Jennings. With his gravelly voice, black hat, and unbreakable swagger, he helped create the outlaw country movement that reshaped Nashville forever. But beneath the leather and legend lay a man consumed by excess. A man who once admitted he snorted his fortune away. Waylon's story is one of brilliance, brotherhood, and self-destruction. A wild ride that left scars deeper than any outlaw song could tell. Born in Littlefield, Texas in 1937, Jennings picked up a guitar before he was 10 and was soon performing on local radio. By his 20s, he was playing bass for Buddy Holly, and fate nearly ended his life early. He famously gave up his seat on the plane that crashed in 1959, killing Holly, Richie Valens, and the Big Bopper. That near miss haunted him for the rest of his life. He often said he felt like he'd cheated death and lived the next 2 decades trying to drown that guilt in drugs, music, and motion. In the 1970s, Waylon became the face of rebellion in country music. Tired of Nashville's polished control, he fought for artistic freedom and won. Hits like Luckenbach, Texas, Are You Sure Hank Done It This Way, and his duets with Willie Nelson made him a superstar. But behind the scenes, he was spiraling. Cocaine became his constant companion, keeping him wired through endless tours and studio sessions. At his worst, he was spending up to $1,500 a day on cocaine, burning through millions as easily as he burned through friendships. Jennings' addiction didn't just drain his bank account, it nearly killed him. He'd go for days without sleep, sweating through performances, his body shaking beneath the lights. His relationships suffered, his health deteriorated, and his creative spark began to fade. Nashville's most defiant outlaw had become a prisoner of his own habits. In one infamous episode, the DEA raided his recording studio in 1977, but Waylon, high and quick-witted, flushed the cocaine before they could arrest him. The incident only added to his myth, but the truth was darker. He was falling apart. By the early 1980s, after years of physical collapse and emotional exhaustion, Waylon's wife, Jessie Coulter, herself a country singer, delivered an ultimatum: get clean or die. Somehow, this time, he listened. He locked himself away, went cold turkey, and clawed his way back from the brink. The recovery was brutal, but the music that followed had a deeper, more weathered soul. He would later reflect, drugs didn't make me an outlaw, they made me a fool. Waylon Jennings lived long enough to tell his story honestly, without glamour or excuses. When he died in 2002, he left behind more than fame. He left a warning. His life was proof that rebellion without control leads to ruin, and that the hardest thing a cowboy can ever do is face himself. 5. Keith Whitley, the voice that drowned in whiskey. Among all the tragic figures in country music, Keith Whitley stands out as the one who had everything: the voice, the charm, the rising fame, and lost it all to the bottle. His story is not of slow decline, but of a meteoric rise and a sudden, heartbreaking fall. By the time the world realized how extraordinary he was, Keith Whitley was already gone. Born in Sandy Hook, Kentucky in 1955, Keith was a prodigy from the start. He won talent contests as a child, performed on local radio, and by his late teens, joined Ralph Stanley's bluegrass band, singing with a depth and maturity that astonished audiences. He was compared to legends like Lefty Frizzell and George Jones before he even turned 20. But that praise came with a curse. Even in his youth, Whitley had developed a dangerous tolerance for alcohol. What started as casual drinking in the Appalachian bars became a lifelong shadow. When Whitley signed with RCA in the mid-1980s, his career took off. Songs like Don't Close Your Eyes, When You Say Nothing at All, and I'm No Stranger to the Rain made him one of country's brightest new stars. His voice was pure velvet, smooth yet aching, with a kind of emotional honesty that couldn't be faked. Fans adored him. Critics hailed him as the future of traditional country, and Nashville saw in him the next great torchbearer. But behind the studio doors, Keith was unraveling. The pressure of fame, perfectionism, and loneliness on the road drove him deeper into the bottle. His friends described him as charming and kind when sober, but unpredictable when drunk. A man torn between brilliance and despair. His wife, Lori Morgan, a rising star herself, tried to help him through countless interventions, but Whitley's demons ran deep. He'd promised to quit, stay sober for weeks, and then vanish into days-long binges. His producers had to work around his drinking, often recording vocals in fragments, capturing the magic in brief, lucid moments before the whiskey took over. On May 9, 1989, after a short period of sobriety, Keith Whitley woke up in his Nashville home, drank heavily throughout the morning, and collapsed. His blood alcohol level was .477, nearly 5 times the legal limit. He was just 33 years old. The man who sang about rain and heartache had drowned in both. Whitley's death sent shockwaves through the country world. At his funeral, stars wept openly. Even hardened industry veterans couldn't believe that such a luminous talent had burned out so quickly. Posthumously, his songs climbed the charts, becoming bittersweet reminders of what could have been. Every time When You Say Nothing at All plays, there's a haunting ache, the sense of a future stolen. Keith Whitley's voice remains one of the most beautiful ever to grace country music, and one of its most tragic. His story is the reminder that sometimes the saddest songs are not written. 6. Townes Van Zandt, the poet who wrote his own eulogy. If country music ever had a poet laureate of pain, it was Townes Van Zandt. His songs weren't written for radio or fame. They were carved from loneliness, addiction, and quiet despair. A brilliant songwriter and a fragile soul, Townes lived his entire life in the borderlands between genius and oblivion. To hear his music is to feel both awe and ache, because every lyric carried a little piece of his slow self-destruction. Born in Fort Worth, Texas, in 1944, Townes grew up in a wealthy but emotionally distant family. He was bright, restless, and troubled, the kind of boy who saw too much too soon. In college, doctors diagnosed him with manic depression and subjected him to insulin shock therapy, which left him with permanent memory loss. That trauma marked the beginning of his long, tragic affair with alcohol and heroin, the two companions that would follow him until death. In the late 1960s, Townes began performing in smoky Texas bars, often barefoot and disheveled, guitar in hand, eyes distant. His songwriting was otherworldly. Pancho and Lefty, Waiting Around to Die, and To Live Is to Fly weren't just songs. They were confessions, elegies for lives already lost. His friends said he seemed incapable of separating art from suffering. He'd play to a half-empty room, then disappear for days, sleeping on floors, shooting up in dingy motels, living like a ghost who only came alive when he sang. Heroin dulled his sadness, but it also devoured him. He was known to pass out mid-performance, wake up, and continue playing as if nothing had happened. His relationships, especially with women, were chaotic, filled with love, fear, and pain. His close friend and fellow songwriter Guy Clark once said, "Townes wasn't addicted to drugs. He was addicted to sadness." It wasn't far from the truth. Townes seemed to chase ruin like it was his calling. Through the 1970s and 1980s, his reputation as a songwriter's songwriter grew, even as his body withered. Stars like Willie Nelson and Emmylou Harris recorded his songs and turned them into hits, while Townes himself sank deeper into obscurity and addiction. He lived in trailers and cheap apartments, sometimes with no running water, often surrounded by empty bottles. He joked darkly that he'd be famous after he was dead, and he was right. On January 1st, 1997, Townes Van Zandt died of heart failure at age 52 after years of drinking and drug abuse. He had broken a few ribs in a fall, refused proper medical treatment, and died on his couch, alone with his guitar nearby. The irony was cruel. He died on the same date as Hank Williams Sr., his idol and kindred spirit, exactly 44 years later. Townes once wrote, "There ain't no dark till something shines." His songs were that fragile shine, born from darkness, shimmering for those who could still hear beauty in brokenness. He never sought redemption, but his music gave it to others. In the end, Townes Van Zandt didn't just sing about sorrow, he became its voice. Number 7. Tammy Wynette, the First Lady of Country and the Prison of Pain. If country music had a tragic queen, her crown would belong to Tammy Wynette. With a trembling voice that could turn heartbreak into art, she embodied the strength and sorrow of Southern womanhood. Yet behind the elegant dresses, the perfect hair, and the title First Lady of Country Music, Tammy lived a private nightmare, one filled with pills, pain, and quiet suffering that fame could never heal. Born Virginia Wynette Pugh in a small Mississippi town in 1942, Tammy grew up in poverty, picking cotton and dreaming of a better life. Her father died when she was a baby, leaving her mother to raise her alone. From the beginning, Tammy learned two things: how to work hard and how to hide pain. When she moved to Nashville in the mid-1960s, she was a single mother with 3 kids, working as a hairdresser. But her voice, raw, emotional, unmistakably human, caught the attention of producer Billy Sherrill, and within a year, Tammy Wynette was a star. Her songs, Divorce, Stand By Your Man, Till I Can Make It on My Own, became anthems of heartbreak and endurance. They made her rich and famous, but they also mirrored her reality. Behind the glamour, Tammy's life was chaos. She suffered from chronic medical problems, enduring more than 30 surgeries over her lifetime. To manage the pain, doctors prescribed painkillers and sedatives, and soon, Tammy was addicted. The pills became her silent companion, a way to keep performing, smiling, and standing on stage even when her body screamed for rest. Her marriage to George Jones, country's greatest voice, was as legendary as it was destructive. They were the royal couple of Nashville, and its most volatile. Jones's alcoholism collided with Tammy's pill dependency in a storm of violence, tears, and broken promises. Their love produced timeless duets like Golden Ring and We're Gonna Hold On, but offstage, they were falling apart. After their divorce, Tammy's health worsened, her trust eroded, and her reliance on medication deepened. By the 1980s, her addiction had become impossible to hide. She collapsed during performances, slurred words in interviews, and was hospitalized multiple times. Rumors swirled about mysterious kidnappings and overdoses, some true, some exaggerated, but all fueled by the tragic aura surrounding her. Tammy often claimed her body was failing her, but in truth, it was the years of dependency tearing her apart from within. She lived in constant pain, both physical and emotional, her life resembling the very ballads she sang. On April 6, 1998, Tammy Wynette died in her sleep at her Nashville home. The cause was heart failure, but toxicology reports later revealed traces of multiple painkillers and sedatives in her system. She was 55 years old. Nashville mourned not just a singer, but a symbol, the woman who had stood by her man, even when no one stood by her. Tammy Wynette's legacy endures as both triumph and tragedy. Her voice remains immortal, soaring through radios and memories, a reminder of how pain and beauty can coexist. In every trembling note she sang, there was a woman trying to survive the very heartbreak she gave a voice to, and losing herself in the process. 8. Merle Haggard, the rebel who couldn't outrun his demons. Few country artists captured the grit and soul of working-class America like Merle Haggard. He was the voice of the outlaw, the convict, and the dreamer, a man who lived the stories he sang. But behind the legend stood a tortured figure haunted by guilt, rage, and addiction. From prison cells to the top of the charts, Merle's life was a long struggle between redemption and relapse, music and madness. Born in Oildale, California in 1937, Haggard grew up in the shadow of hardship. His father died when he was just 9, leaving him angry and restless. That loss, combined with poverty, sent him spiraling into rebellion. By his teens, Merle was a petty criminal, hopping trains, forging checks, and stealing cars. His mother, desperate and heartbroken, could only watch as he slipped further away. At 20, he landed in San Quentin State Prison for attempted robbery, a place where darkness could swallow a man whole. But inside those walls, Haggard found clarity. He watched Johnny Cash perform for inmates and vowed to turn his life around. When he was released in 1960, Haggard poured his soul into music. Songs like Mama Tried, Sing Me Back Home, and Okie from Muskogee made him one of the most authentic voices in country history. He sang for the broken because he was one of them. But fame brought its own prisons. Touring, recording, and living under constant scrutiny reignited his old self-destructive instincts. He began using amphetamines to stay awake on the road and alcohol to come down afterward. The cycle became relentless. By the 1970s, Haggard was a superstar and a wreck. He could charm a crowd of thousands one night and destroy a hotel room the next. His addictions fractured his marriages and strained his friendships. He would later admit that drugs made him feel invincible, but they also made him cruel. I was running from something, he said years later, but I didn't know what. Fame had given him everything he'd ever wanted, except peace. His music grew darker, more introspective. Songs like Footlights and Kern River hinted at the man behind the myth, weary, regretful, haunted by ghosts of his past. By the early 1980s, the drugs and drinking caught up with him. His voice began to weaken, his health deteriorated, and the fire that once fueled him dimmed. It took near-death experiences and the intervention of his fifth wife, Teresa Lane, for Haggard to finally confront his addictions. With her help, he found stability and, in time, sobriety. In his later years, Merle became something rare in country music, a survivor. He toured into his 70s, his face lined with experience, his songs deeper than ever. When he sang, "If We Make It Through December," it no longer sounded like a lyric. It sounded like his life's mantra. Merle Haggard died in 2016, fittingly on his 79th birthday. By then, the rebel had finally made peace with himself. But his story remains a cautionary tale, proof that even the toughest outlaws can be brought to their knees by addiction. He once said, "Freedom is everything, but it comes with a price." Merle paid that price in pain, and his music remains the receipt. 9. Steve Earle, the renegade who fought his way back from hell. Steve Earle was never built for the clean, polished world of mainstream country. He was the outlaw's outlaw, a poet, a fighter, a man who lived on the edge of brilliance and destruction. His songs were sharp as knives and honest to the bone, but for nearly 2 decades, his greatest battle wasn't with Nashville. It was with heroin, crack cocaine, and himself. Born in Fort Monroe, Virginia, in 1955, Steve grew up idolizing the hard-living troubadours who came before him, Townes Van Zandt and Guy Clark, both of whom became his mentors. Like them, he believed in truth over perfection, art over approval. In the 1980s, he exploded onto the scene with his debut album, Guitar Town, hailed as a masterpiece that redefined country rock. Critics called him the new voice of blue-collar America, raw, rebellious, and real. But behind that success was a man barely holding it together. Earle had always dabbled in drugs, but fame turned indulgence into obsession. The constant touring, the pressure to outdo himself, and the need to feel invincible pushed him deeper into addiction. Heroin became his lifeline, and when that wasn't enough, he added crack cocaine to the mix. Friends said he'd disappear for weeks at a time, re-emerging gaunt and paranoid. He wrecked relationships, burned bridges with record labels, and alienated almost everyone who cared for him. By the early 1990s, he was completely consumed. At his lowest point, Steve Earle wasn't just addicted, he was lost. His once brilliant career had collapsed. He stopped recording, stopped touring, and started living on the streets of Nashville. He was arrested multiple times for drug possession and weapons charges, eventually serving time in prison. For most, that would have been the end. But somehow, Earle wasn't done. In 1994, after a brutal detox behind bars, he began clawing his way back from the ashes. His comeback was nothing short of miraculous. He got clean, returned to writing, and released Train a Comin' in 1995, a haunting, stripped-down reflection of survival. The songs weren't about fame or success. They were about redemption. His voice was rougher, his lyrics darker, but his soul was clearer than ever. Albums like I Feel Alright and El Corazon turned him into a cult hero, not for his rebellion, but for his resilience. He openly spoke about his past, using it not as shame but as a warning, proof that addiction doesn't care how talented you are. Earle also became a mentor to young artists, teaching songwriting and speaking about recovery. But the scars never fully faded. He lost friends, marriages, and years he could never reclaim. He would later say, "I don't regret what I did. I regret the time I wasted doing it." That honesty, brutal and unfiltered, made him one of country's most authentic survivors. Today, Steve Earle stands as both a cautionary tale and a symbol of endurance. He walked through the fire that destroyed so many before him and somehow came out still singing. His music reminds us that redemption isn't clean or easy. It's a daily battle. And in that fight, Earle found the one thing drugs never gave him: 10. David Allan Coe, the wildman who mistook chaos for freedom. If there was ever a man who embodied the dark, lawless spirit of country music, it was David Allan Coe. He wasn't just an outlaw, he was the outlaw other outlaws warned you about. With his gravel-thick voice, biker tattoos, and unpredictable temper, Coe built a career on controversy. But behind the bravado and rebellion was a man devoured by drugs, violence, and self-inflicted chaos, forever teetering between genius and disaster. Born in Akron, Ohio in 1939, Coe's early life read like a cautionary tale from the start. He ran away from home as a boy, lived on the streets, and by his teens was in and out of reform schools and prisons. He claimed to have spent nearly 20 years behind bars, where he began writing songs and cultivating his outlaw image. Whether all his stories were true or not, one thing was certain: David Allan Coe was dangerous, to himself and to everyone around him. When he emerged in the early 1970s, Nashville didn't know what to do with him. He wasn't polite, polished, or marketable. But when Johnny Cash and Shel Silverstein started praising his songwriting, people took notice. His early hits, like You Never Even Called Me By My Name and The Ride, showed flashes of brilliance, deeply Southern, darkly funny, and brutally honest. But fame couldn't tame him. Coe lived like a man on a permanent bender. drugs, women, and endless road trips fueled by whiskey and cocaine. By the late 70s, he was firmly part of the outlaw country scene, performing alongside Waylon Jennings and Willie Nelson. But while those men found ways to balance rebellion with professionalism, Coe dove headfirst into self-destruction. Cocaine and speed became his daily fuel. He'd show up late to shows, start fights with promoters, and alienate nearly everyone in the business. He bragged about his arrests, flaunted his addictions, and seemed to mistake recklessness for authenticity. To many, he wasn't just an outlaw. He was a ticking bomb. His addictions grew worse as the years passed. He burned through marriages, money, and respect. The same fire that once made him magnetic now made him unbearable. Even his friends in the outlaw movement began to distance themselves. Still, Coe couldn't stop. He was addicted not just to drugs, but to chaos itself, to living like he was always one step from the grave. By the 1980s, his music became increasingly controversial. He released underground albums filled with explicit lyrics and racial slurs that effectively destroyed any chance of mainstream redemption. Behind the scenes, his health and mind were deteriorating. He overdosed multiple times, survived car crashes, and continued touring in a haze of painkillers and resentment. To the end, he refused to play by anyone's rules, even when those rules might have saved his life. In his later years, Coe mellowed only slightly, still defiant but visibly haunted. He admitted that drugs had taken too much, friends, family, and decades of music he could have written sober. Yet he remained unapologetic, saying, "I lived the way I sang. You can't fake that." It was both his truth and his curse. David Allan Coe's story is the most dangerous kind of country tragedy, not one of victimhood, but of self-destruction. He wasn't ruined by the system or the fame. He was ruined by himself. And even now, long after the spotlight dimmed, his legend stands as a brutal reminder. Some outlaws never learn where the line is, until it's far too late. Chapter 11. Glen Campbell, the Rhinestone Cowboy's battle with the mirror. Few stars ever shined as brightly or fell as painfully as Glen Campbell. With his perfect voice, movie star looks, and guitar skills that could silence a room, he was Nashville's golden boy. But behind the glitter of Rhinestone Cowboy and the smiles on television was a man battling loneliness, self-doubt, and a devastating addiction to alcohol and cocaine that nearly destroyed him. Born in Billstown, Arkansas, in 1936, Glen was one of 12 children raised in a dirt-poor farming family. Music was his escape. By his teens, he was a virtuoso guitarist, eventually landing in Los Angeles as a sought-after session musician. He played on hundreds of recordings, from Frank Sinatra to the Beach Boys, before launching his solo career. In the late 1960s and 70s, hits like Wichita Lineman, By the Time I Get to Phoenix, and Galveston made him one of the biggest stars in the world. On stage, he was the picture of grace. Off stage, he was falling apart. Success had isolated him. Touring endlessly, appearing on television, and being marketed as America's wholesome cowboy left him emotionally hollow. To fill the void, he turned to alcohol, first as comfort, then as a crutch. By the mid-1970s, when fame began to wane, cocaine entered his life, and it became a storm he couldn't control. The drug's rush fueled his performances and masked his pain, but it also brought out his darkest impulses. His relationships turned volatile, his temper unpredictable. He'd vanish for days, burn through fortunes, and show up to interviews glassy-eyed and incoherent. His infamous relationship with Tanya Tucker, who was 22 years his junior, became tabloid fuel, a whirlwind of passion, drugs, and destruction. The two were madly in love and equally self-destructive, enabling each other's addictions. Their fights were legendary, often violent and public. Nashville didn't know whether to pity or judge them, and the press dubbed their pairing country's most toxic romance. Campbell's clean-cut image shattered, and his career followed. By the early 1980s, Glen was spiraling. He was arrested for drunk driving and assaulting a police officer, his mugshot becoming an icon of a fallen hero. For a man once beloved by America, it was a humiliating descent. But somehow, amid the chaos, a flicker of redemption appeared. He found faith, sought rehab, and slowly began to rebuild. He remarried, embraced Christianity, and started using his story to help others. He admitted that cocaine had nearly killed him, not just physically, but spiritually. When Campbell returned to the spotlight in the 1990s and 2000s, it was as a survivor. He performed with humility, openly discussing his past struggles and the cost of addiction. His final act came with heartbreaking grace. After being diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease, he embarked on a farewell tour, performing until he no longer could remember the lyrics. Even as his mind faded, his voice carried fragments of the man he once was, pure, haunting, eternal. Glenn Campbell died in 2017 at age 81. By then, the world no longer saw the scandal, only the man who had fought through the darkness to sing again. His life remains one of country's most human stories, proof that behind even the brightest rhinestones, there can be cracks filled with pain, and that redemption sometimes arrives not in glory, but in grace. Nasher 12, Justin Townes Earle, the son who couldn't outrun the shadow. For Justin Townes Earle, music wasn't just a calling, it was a legacy and a curse. As the son of Steve Earle and the godson of Townes Van Zandt, he was born into a world of genius and addiction, love and loss. Nashville expected him to be the next great storyteller. Instead, he became the final chapter in a generational tragedy, a man haunted by the same demons that consumed the two figures who gave him his name. Born in Nashville, Tennessee in 1982, Justin grew up surrounded by music, but starved of stability. His father, Steve, was deep in the throes of heroin and crack addiction during Justin's childhood, often absent for long stretches. When he was there, he was erratic and volatile. Justin later said, "I learned two things from my dad, how to write songs and how to destroy yourself." By the time he was a teenager, Justin was already experimenting with alcohol and heroin, trying to numb the pain of a father he admired but could never fully reach. Despite the chaos, Justin had talent, extraordinary talent. His songwriting was poetic yet grounded, blending folk, blues, and Americana with a lyrical maturity beyond his years. Critics hailed him as one of the brightest voices of his generation. Albums like Harlem River Blues, Midnight at the Movies, and Kids in the Street were intimate, soulful, and hauntingly beautiful. He sang about loneliness, addiction, and survival with the weary honesty of a man twice his age. Fans loved his music for its raw truth. They didn't realize how much of that truth was autobiographical. But the ghosts never left him. Addiction, depression, and self-doubt shadowed every success. Justin got clean several times, each time swearing he'd beaten it. He spoke openly about his struggles, using interviews to warn others of the price of fame and chemicals. Yet, just like his father and his namesake before him, the pull of the darkness was too strong. He once said, "Recovery isn't a finish line. It's a daily fight. Some days you win, some days you don't." In the late 20s and 10s, Justin seemed to find balance. He married and became a father, channeling his focus into family and music. But in 2020, as the pandemic swept across the world and isolation deepened, his inner war reignited. On August 20th, 2020, he was found dead in his Nashville apartment. The cause was an accidental overdose of fentanyl-laced drugs. He was only 38 years old. The news shattered the country and Americana community. For his father, Steve Earle, it was a cruel echo of history repeating itself. Months later, he released JT, an album dedicated to his son, filled with grief, guilt, and love. In it, he sang, "The last time we spoke was on the phone, and we hung up before I said goodbye." It was the sound of a father mourning not just a son, but a mirror of his own past. Justin Townes Earle's death marked the end of a three-generation saga of brilliance and addiction, from Townes Van Zandt to Steve Earle, and finally to Justin. His songs remain as his epitaph, tender, flawed, and true. He once sang, "I've been lost and I've been found, but never free." In that line, he told his own story, the story of a man who could write about salvation, but never quite reach it.